I'm going to be delivering a class after we're done, after Musaf services are over. We're going to talk about the halakha of unmasking, and I have some sources for that. So I'm just going to speak briefly now and just share a little insight from Parashat Tsav to appreciate some of what was read this morning. Parashat Tsav, as I said earlier, reviews the laws of the sacrifices, and one of those sacrifices is called the Korban Todah, the sacrifice of thanksgiving. What's interesting about the Parsha is that while it reviews the laws, it doesn't say when you give one sacrifice versus another. There are many different kinds, and the Torah isn't clear when you give one versus the other. But you know that we have an oral tradition and a written tradition. So you need the oral tradition, the Talmud, to explain when different sacrifices were given. When was the Korban Todah given? Well, this is what the Talmud says. It was given if you crossed the ocean. It was given if you wandered in the desert and then found your way home. It was given if you recovered from an illness, and it was given if you were freed from captivity. 4 reasons. How do we know it was those 4? The Talmud asks. From the word chayim. Chayim, life. Chayim is spelled in Hebrew chet, yud, yud, mem. Chet stands for chavush, a captive. Yud stands for yisurim, someone who is ill, in pain. Yisurim means suffering. The other yud, yam, the sea. And mem, midbar, someone who is in the desert wandering and finds his way home. By the way, what's relevant about that is those are the same 4 reasons that a person is obligated to bench gomel. I don't know if you've heard of benching gomel before. It happens from time to time, where somebody who recovers from an illness, for example, might say a special blessing at the Torah, Hagomel l'chayavim tovot shegmalani goltov. Thank you, God, for releasing me from a bad place to a good place. So the Korban Todah, the sacrifice of thanksgiving, is like the ancient version of Birkat HaGomel. That's one explanation for the root of the word Chayim. Chayim is gratitude. One cannot live a full life without being grateful for the blessings like health, like freedom, like well-being, right? But there's another interesting explanation of the word life that relates to our ofruf this morning, and actually relates to, I hope, all of our lives. And that is the interesting grammatical notion that chayim is a plural word. In Hebrew, the way you make a word plural is you add either im, if it's a masculine word, or ot. At the end, it becomes for a feminine word. So on Rosh Hashanah, what do we eat? Tapu, chim, udvash, apples and honey. Chayim has no singular form. Why? What's life when you're all alone? A full life, on one interpretation, means being grateful for your blessings, but the one I prefer, although the first is certainly true, is that life is really at its best with meaningful, strong, life-affirming relationships. So for Jade and Noah, l'chaim. We'll continue in the service with Musaf. Okay, so we're going to talk today about the halakha of unmasking. What this is really about is what Jewish values ought to guide the decisions that I'm making both for myself and that a community has to make in the wake of the government's relaxation rules for the masking requirement. Looking around, I see that everybody here is wearing a mask. So let me ask you, what Jewish values have guided your decision to wear a mask to shul this morning? Just call it out. What Jewish values have guided your decision to wear a mask this morning? Don't tell me... Pikuach nefesh. Very good. I should... Pikuach nefesh means what, Doug?
Keeping everybody well.
Keeping everybody well, saving your own life. Very good. Guarding your health, one might say. Someone else called out something? Chazan? Very good. Chazan said, Dina de Malchuta Dina. What does that mean? One is required to observe the law of the land. If provincial health authorities mandate wearing a mask, I guess we have to wear one. If we live in a society where nobody follows the law, it will be chaos. So it is a Jewish value also to follow the law of the land. What else? No, that's not a crazy thing to say. I'm not sure what Jewish value that is, but maybe community. My desire to participate in the service with community obligates me to conform to the laws of that community. Yes, Chazan again. Al tibrosh min hatzibur. Do not do that which is separate or different or distinct from the rest of the community. What else? Harvey. What?
Precedent.
I didn't hear what.
Precedent.
Precedent. Okay. In what sense, Harvey? You mean because you're used to wearing a mask, you ought to keep wearing one? Tradition. So mask has already become tradition for you? Okay. What about this one? What I wear on my mask? Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. That's another big one. Love your neighbor as yourself. Maybe I'm not so concerned, but there are others who will be around me in a communal setting who might prefer that others wear masks around them, and that might guide my decision also. Even if I don't care to wear a mask, I should do it because I should love my neighbor as myself. Chazan again. Ushmartem et nafshotechem. We're going to see that. Take good care of yourself. Well, if wearing a mask can reduce medical risk to my own well-being, I should wear a mask. I'm obligated to my own health. Very similar, Doug, to your comment about pikuach nefesh. I would add just one more. What about lo ta'amod al dam re'echa? Some Jewish sources quote that verse. Do not stand idly upon the blood of your brother. To disregard other people's well-being is almost to be responsible for an illness that they may potentially receive. There's another hand. Stan. So thank you for the opening, Stan. This is why I have a class. I have a class today because of Stan's question. Stan's question is, are all of these values absolute? Do they know no limit? Right? We're going to get there in just a moment. To summarize all of these concerns and values which have influenced all of you to wear your masks this morning, we quote from the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law. Follow with me, the first source on the page. Any matter that threatens human life, it is a positive commandment to remove it and guard against it and be very careful about the matter. As it is written, guard yourself and guard your soul. Chazan quoted that verse. Watch yourself. If you look, by the way, at where this verse is taken from, it seems in its context to have nothing to do with health and well-being, but that's okay. Rabbis can pick and choose even a few verses and take them out of context, a few words or a few verses, take them out of context to prove a point. If a person does not remove it and leaves the matter, which results in danger, a person nullifies a positive commandment and transgresses a negative commandment. Do not place blood. That's similar to the law of standing idly on the blood of your brother. That's a negative commandment. Do not stand idly on the blood of your brother. So you violate a positive commandment and a negative commandment. The sages forbade many things because there is in them life-threatening danger, including not placing one's mouth on a flowing pipe and drinking. I'm not really sure what this is, but it sounds like something unadvisable. Not drinking at night from wells and ponds. That makes sense. Why? Lest one swallow a leech and not see it. So even though these are things that you might need to do in a particular circumstance, and even though there's something that a doctor might tell you you shouldn't do, Jewish law also forbids it. The sages forbade it, because the same value that drives the work of a medical professional, that is to preserve life, also drives the work of every rabbi, of every Jew. We're also required to do whatever it takes to preserve our life. Here is something interesting. Just pay attention to how this ends. Anyone who transgresses these things and related items and says, "Behold, I endanger myself and others," or "I'm not careful in this," the court gives him lashes of rebellion, and one who guards themselves from these will come good blessing. The Hebrew is, if you say to yourself, "Hareini misakein ba'atzmi u'ma la'acherim bekach alai," I would actually translate that differently than here. I would change the translation to, "What is it any of your business what I do with my body?" Right? Anyone who says that, who says it, not who does something. It says if you say such a thing, makinoto markat mardut, you get whipped. These were in the days when rabbis could whip people. Too bad. Those were the days, yeah. Imagine that. When I am doing something which might endanger myself, we're being reminded here there are implications beyond just you. I might say in 2022, think of the nurses and the doctors who are going to have to take care of you if you went and drank from that pond and swallowed a leech. Think of the person whose operation, speak to doctors, by the way, about how many operations had to be delayed because of people who were unvaccinated filling up the ICUs. So you are not allowed to have the attitude that the nurses, the doctors, the people who got bumped off the waiting list, that I'm not responsible for them. Isn't that interesting? This is 600, 500, 600 years ago. And even though we're not dealing with an advanced medical system, there is still a Jewish value clearly articulated that the decisions you make on your life have implications for the wider community, and therefore you are not allowed to disregard others and say, what I do with my body is my business and nobody else's. Isn't that fascinating? That's why I chose this verse to introduce. In the second source, you have the famous exemption from fasting on Yom Kippur. Many of us know about this. If a doctor tells you you need to eat, this might apply to somebody who is a diabetic or for some other reason has to take medications on Yom Kippur which would otherwise not be allowed. What does Jewish law say? This is from the compendium of the laws of Shabbat, the most famous one, called Shmirat Shabbat Kehilchata, a tremendous 3-volume book on all the laws of Shabbat and holidays. And he says, one relies on the doctor's opinion. If a doctor tells you you need to eat, whether the doctor was Jewish or not Jewish, when he says that the patient has to eat, you listen to him. Even if the patient thinks otherwise, I think this doctor's just being too strict. And even if the patient is himself a doctor and the specialist, you know what they say, doctors make the worst patients. Even if you are a doctor and you say, this doctor is not as good as me, and I know I can fast, you listen to the doctor. Now, getting back to Stan's question, I want to introduce the idea that perhaps these values, laws, ideas, which seem to suggest that my medical well-being and the health of others is a value that trumps everything else, I also want to show you the footnote to that comment in his volume. See the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim is the Rabbi of Yisrael Kagan of Rudin. He's lived in the 19th century, very, very famous rabbi, an important rabbi, who talks about the matter of consulting with non-observant doctors. So what do you think his concern is going to be? If you go to a doctor who is not well versed in Jewish law, that doctor might be influenced to be overly cautious and tell you that you should eat, right? Because no doctor wants to be liable for something that goes wrong. Let's say you don't eat and you get sick. So the doctor might be overly cautious because that doctor does not understand the seriousness of the fasting requirement on Yom Kippur. So what you're seeing in this footnote is an answer to Stan's question. Do all of these values have no end? And it leads to the question in this particular case about fasting on Yom Kippur. What does it mean to be overly cautious? How do we measure? How do we ascertain that a doctor is being too strict or not strict enough with his advice? That's where I introduce this interesting case from the Tosefta. The Tosefta is 2,000 years old. So keep that in mind as we review the specifics of this case about someone going to the mikvah who has an arrow that is stuck in his leg. I tried, as I learned this source, to visualize what that looks like. By the way, why is this a concern? Some of you who know the laws of mikvah know you cannot go into the mikvah with any jewelry on you, a watch that you're wearing. If you go into the mikvah, you are not allowed to have anything appended to you in any way. It's a serious invalidation of going to the mikvah, which, by the way, is very important. And it would disqualify the whole thing. So let's say somebody is injured and an arrow, I'm not sure if it's the whole arrow or just a piece of the arrow, it's probably just a piece of the arrow, gets stuck in their body. The Tosefta, again 2,000 years old, discusses, can that person go into the mikvah or not? Do we require that arrow to be removed? So you can read it over at the top of page 2. There's a difference of opinion. Rabbi Judah says it does not interpose. In other words, he can dunk in the mikvah, no problem. But we have a principle in Jewish law, you rule according to the majority. The majority says, that is the sages say, lo, this interposes. In other words, if you have that arrow stuck in your leg and you go into the mikvah, you've done nothing. It was a prohibited immersion. Why is there a difference of opinion? So the next paragraph explains what the difference of opinion is here between the sages and Rabbi Judah. Rabbi Judah, who does not regard the arrow as a chatzitza, in other words, as something that would invalidate the immersion, bases his ruling on the premise that removing the arrow poses a sakana. Who knows Hebrew? What's sakana? A danger. Rabbi Judah says the reason why we can't force him to take that out is because if we do, he might get hurt. It might be a danger to him. So let him go in without the arrow, with the arrow in him and make an exception. The problem with that is that we are then saying, and you see this in later commentary, but I'll explain it in my own words. What we're then saying is that the sages who disagree with Rabbi Judah want this man to put his life in danger so that he can immerse in the mikvah. Is that what Jewish law says? Does Jewish law say you put yourself in danger in order to immerse in a mikvah? So here's the conclusion of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. He says, sakana is not an actual danger, but a situation where there is a great deal of pain and discomfort. And it is remotely possible, 1 in 1,000, that this could cause danger. All agree that if the arrow was truly dangerous, the arrow would not constitute a chatzitza. In other words, if pulling this arrow out would definitely kill you or make you very, very sick, absolutely you keep it in and go in the mikvah. The disagreement is because the chance of it getting infected would be remote. And look at the language, 1 in 1,000, right? So Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, in answer to Stan's question, there is a measurement here for when risk becomes manageable. Pain, discomfort, 1 in 1,000 chance that you'll get really sick is manageable risk. This is Rabbi Akiva Eiger's opinion. That is different than when something will certainly cause danger, bodily harm and danger. Right? This idea that risk is measured at 1 in 1,000 also finds its way into a law on Shabbat that is quoted underneath. You know, on Shabbat you're not allowed to kill, not allowed to slaughter, you're not allowed to murder anybody anytime. I'm talking about there's an ant, and you have to be careful not to step on the ant. You're not allowed to slaughter, murder on Shabbat. This has to do with, for instance, when they built the sanctuary, some of it was built out of hides. So they would have to slaughter the deer in order to make the hides of the sanctuary. That's forbidden on Shabbat, now and always. That applies also to ants and flies, not allowed to kill them on Shabbat. Can be annoying if you have a cottage. Are you allowed to kill an animal that's dangerous? A snake or a scorpion? So everyone says yes. Why? It's obvious. Your life takes priority over the life of that animal. However, read on page 2 where it talks about the shmamit. There was some animal called the shmamit. Do you see it's the third line at the bottom paragraph on page 2. For those people who kill the shmamit is some sort of insect that we know would fly into people's soup. It's some sort of lizard, very small. Okay. Salamander? Maybe like a salamander? Maybe. Okay. I thought it was some sort of an insect. Okay. Something about this lizard is poisonous, perhaps, but not lethal. So the Magen Avraham is angry at the people who kills the shmamit. Why? Listen to what he says. They violate a clear prohibition since it is not a threat. This is the case even though it can fall in your food. Since this is uncommon, it's not very common that a salamander goes into your soup. And if you want, you can just cover up your plate. And it is only dangerous, listen to the language again, to 1 out of every 1,000 people who consumes it. So you have permission to kill an animal that's truly lethal and dangerous. But when there's just a 1 in 1,000 chance, when there's no direct connection between the presence of that animal and you getting sick, you're not allowed to kill the shmamit. Now, why is this interesting? Because in community, we have an easy question and we have a hard question. Now that the government has said, you determine for yourselves whether you want to wear masks or not. What's the easy decision? Is a person allowed to wear a mask? Of course. Now, I know you say, yeah, but it's not that obvious. The Shulchan Aruch says when a person davens before God, they should look proper. You should look like you're appearing before a king. Right? Well, did you see the picture with Justin Trudeau and Queen Elizabeth? He wasn't wearing a mask. So maybe he took it off because that's not how you appear before a queen. It's not totally obvious that it would be okay to wear a mask, but I think there's enough people have said, give me a break. It doesn't really get in the way. If you can breathe properly, and we're all used to it by now, of course you can wear a mask. But there's a harder question. The harder question is, if somebody is not wearing a mask or refuses to wear a mask, are we entitled to eject them from the building? Are we entitled to eject them from the congregation? Are we entitled to prohibit them from entering? Now, why is that a tough question? Because to eject somebody from a synagogue is equivalent in Jewish law to excommunicating them. You're basically preventing them from joining with the community to do a mitzvah. Well, there are some cases where you can do that. If a person came, like smoking, but look at the example of the lizard. If that person was really dangerous, if there's a direct correlation between that person, like if somebody came in with a gun and said, no, I'm just here to pray, you can't let that person in. Somebody who's truly dangerous, you are allowed to get in the way. But what about when the risk is low? What about when it's like a shmamit, where, yes, the salamander could poison your soup, but it's 1 in 1,000. And you could just cover your soup. In other words, there are ways to manage the risk. Think about that. 2 other concepts that I want to introduce you to, and then I'll let you eat. The first is the concept in managing risk called Shomer Pta'im Hashem. Shomer Pta'im Hashem means God protects the simple. It's taken from a passage in the Talmud that I have here before you. You can read it over if you want, but basically it says, look, there are some times where risk can be managed. And even though it's not a perfect situation, you're not eliminating the risk. There are low levels of risk where we just say, God protect the simple. In other words, we have to say, we have to live our lives. And we can't eliminate risk. Sometimes it's just impossible. And we sort of leave up our hands to God and say, God will take care of us. Think about somebody who wants to, this is a terrible, terrible verse for a Jewish mother, right? Jewish mothers struggle with Shomer P'tayim Hashem, which basically means just let people manage risk in their own life. Mother, don't smother. Carmela went downstairs, so I'm okay saying this. There are normal activities that involve risk that we do day to day. The most dangerous one in this province is pulling up on the 401 highway. To an extreme opinion might say, you're not allowed to drive on the 401 because the risk of an accident of driving on a highway is significant enough where we consider it to be not taking care of yourself and others. But this notion of Shomer P'tayim Hashem, there are some instances where you just have to live your life and accept that that comes with a level of risk, right? That is also a real thing in Jewish law. And this is the connection to the Parsha, by the way. Remember I mentioned earlier, who is the person who offers the sacrifice of thanksgiving? It's someone who is ill, someone who is freed, but what were the other two? Someone who takes a journey at sea and somebody who travels through the wilderness. Well, I could say to that person, you shouldn't have traveled at sea. You shouldn't have wandered in the wilderness, taken a difficult journey. The equivalent today really would be, you shouldn't have driven on the 401. But obviously these things are allowed. Or we wouldn't be up here saying the blessing, thank you God for my life. We wouldn't be up here saying them, acknowledging our gratitude for surviving those difficult experiences if those experiences were prohibited in the first place. Not only that, look at this line in the second English paragraph on page 3. If one must travel by sea to fulfill a certain mitzvah, he is certainly obligated to travel. Not only is there a level of risk that is acceptable, there is a level of risk that mandates you in Jewish law to just say, it's up to God. We can't eliminate risk. We can just manage it, and hopefully everything will be okay. You should say that prayer every time you get on the 401. Right? That's the connection to our Parsha. Dangerous things are allowed in Jewish law. But where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line? Here are two rabbis who help us draw the line. Page 3, Rabbi Lifshitz. You should know that when it comes to things that entail danger, nevertheless, if it is something which is the way of the world and a necessity, there is no concern. After all, 4 people are required to give thanks, and 2 of them are desert travelers and travelers at sea. What I just said. Thus, if they entail danger, yet it is permissible to voyage out to sea and to travel in the desert, why do we not forbid this due to danger? It is clear that when it comes to things such as these, which are necessary for the world, letzorech ha'olam in Hebrew, there is no prohibition whatsoever. Where is the line that Rabbi Lifshitz draws? These are things that you really need to do in order to get by. In order to get by, you have to take on a certain level of risk. And it's allowed because everybody else is doing it. It's the way of the world. That's different than skydiving out of a plane. One might be able to make a case that you going skydiving is not what most people do and is not necessary. If you want to make a case that that really is pushing the boundaries, you can do so. But that's very different than other activities which involve risk that we just have to do every day, like get in the car and drive places. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach draws the line somewhere else. At least he admits what is a risk to life and what isn't, and where the boundary lies. I, too, in my humility, have had many doubts about this. That's an interesting sentence. Where you draw the line is very hard to fix that somewhere objectively. But logically, it would seem, in my humble opinion, that anything which most people normally run away from for the sake of escaping danger is considered a possible risk to life. But if most people are not frightened and afraid of something, then it is not considered danger. He doesn't say that this is a particularly Jewish question. He says we navigate risk by looking at the world around us. And if most people, it's almost like trusting human intuition. If most people are okay doing these risky things, like flying, driving, you can list a whole number of it, going to an amusement park, that you can make a case it's dangerous. But most people seem to be okay with it. And if most people are, then you are permitted to take on that level of risk. And I would say also forbidden from imposing that activity as being too dangerous and prohibiting that person from engaging or participating in a mitzvah because of that. How do we determine if mask wearing falls into that category or not? Obviously, it doesn't work to look around in the supermarket and see whether people are wearing a mask or not. Why doesn't that work? Because unlike driving, where we all do our best, hopefully, to drive safely, some of us have different health concerns than others. Your doctor may very well be telling you, you need to wear a mask. I don't care what the province decides. So let's first make that clear. If your doctor says you need to be wearing a mask because you're immunocompromised, taking care of a sick person, etc., you have to wear one. You can't get out of that in Jewish law simply because it's uncomfortable. The mandate to take care of your life comes first. But if other people who are similar to you, I would say, in age, in demographic, in health, maybe having no health conditions, then you could look around and say, well, nobody seems to be wearing a mask. The requirement that I have to protect my own life must be balanced against the reality that some risk cannot be eliminated, and I have the right in Jewish law to take it off. Now, how does that help communities navigate? We have an obligation to check always and and be in touch with what the real risks are of a dangerous outcome from a COVID transmission. And I think we've tried to do that from the beginning of the pandemic. That means take a look at what vaccination rates are. Speak to our health professionals. Are we in a particularly dangerous wave or not? What's the epidemiological situation? How many of our people are vaccinated and how many are not vaccinated? Why do we have to be in touch? Because as you said, a Stan's question, none of these values are absolute. When risks get high, we should institute a mask mandate no matter what the province says. When risks are low, we can leave it up to people to make their own decisions. It all should follow the real science, the real evidence. Now, it's hard to do in a country like this where everybody has their own opinion. I'm on Twitter and I read what different people say about the virus, and consensus, give me a break. is very, very hard to find consensus. So the final paragraph I have here of David Lichtenstein says, this is what you do when you can't find a consensus. And you're all going to roll your eyes at this, but if you can propose a better alternative, I want to hear it. He says, we may conclude that indeed the guidelines established by a country's health officials in an attempt to balance the need to avoid the risk of widespread infection against the need for a functioning economy, ipso facto become the halakhically acceptable standard. As such, going out into the public in accordance with health officials' safety requirements would be permissible under the rule of Shomer P'tayim Hashem, which means we live with risk every day. We do our best to make personal decisions to manage it, but eliminating it cannot be the goal, or we'll never be able to leave our houses at all. Now, look, if we were living in Florida and we had their health officer, I might tell you, don't listen to this. I heard him talk once, the Florida health officer, and I have serious doubts about whether their health officers really have our well-being at heart, or whether they have political interests ahead of those. But I will tell you, throughout the pandemic, like most of you, I've been watching the health officer of the city of Toronto, Mrs. Davila. I've been watching Mrs. Tam, the health officer for the country, and they've frustrated me beyond belief, and the provincial health officers, there have been a few, and there's a whole committee. I really do think our health officials are good people who have the best interests of the community at heart and are not overly influenced by economic factors or lobbyists in determining levels of risk within the community. So I am inclined to agree with Rabbi Lichtenstein on his position and say, if the province permits an activity, it is they are making the statement that that level of risk is acceptable and manageable. In other words, in the same category as the man with the arrow stuck in his leg, or the shmamit that I'm not allowed to kill on Shabbat, we find ourselves dealing with those situations. Doug, your question about smoking is very different. There's a direct correlation between inhaling secondhand smoke and increased risk for lung cancer or some other, or emphysema, or some other terrible outcome.
Chief Rabbi Israel says, don't smoke.
Right. And I would argue that those who say you cannot smoke, that it is forbidden, or Jewish law, say, no, it's the lizard, not the shmamit. The correlation is too direct. The health risks are too serious. So what does this mean for our community at the end of the day? One of my jobs as a rabbi is to pipe in when I think there are halachic implications to discussions, to just make Jewish law's voice known. I do not believe, given our vaccination rates and the current epidemiological reality, I do not believe that in Jewish law you are permitted to eject somebody from synagogue for not wearing a mask. That said, why did I think it was important to speak from the pulpit about this? Because I think it is very appropriate and proper. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. To be mindful of the fact that our community is comprised of many people who are compromised in their health, and that wearing a mask, right? And I don't want to shame anybody who makes a decision not to. I'm conscious of that. There are people who find it difficult to breathe with masks on, and we don't want a community where people are wagging their fingers one at another. That's called derech eretz, another important value. But I hope that people, when they make the decision starting on Monday, whether to put a mask on, will remember the first saying here, that it's not enough to just say, I'm okay with wearing a mask, with not wearing a mask, and it's your problem. You navigate around me. If you do that, and we were living 500 years ago, I could get my whip. One should say, I am responsible for me, and also I'm here in this building to practice a Judaism that is based on love your neighbor as yourself. And if I was immunocompromised, I certainly would want the person next to me to be sensitive and cautious and make me feel a little safer by putting a mask on. There are some things in synagogue life that can be made policies. This, unfortunately, is not one of them. This is something where we have to turn to our community and say, you've learned what values are at heart, the important Jewish values, to make your own decision. And I hope we'll do what's right. Shabbat Shalom.